The candles along Lord Ashvale's dining table numbered 23, and Cecily Vane had counted them twice before the soup arrived, because counting was better than listening to Lady Marbrook describe the correct pronunciation of a Latin epitaph. Lady Marbrook sat 4 seats to Cecily's right, which was already an indignity, because ladies' maids did not sit at dinner tables. They stood behind chairs, or they supped in the servants' hall, or they were invisible in all the ways that unmarried women of reduced circumstance learned to be invisible when the world stopped needing them to be otherwise. But Lord Ashvale's household was strange in ways Cecily had not yet finished cataloguing, and the strangeness had begun the morning she arrived with her single trunk and her employer's 6-year-old niece, who had announced to the butler that the lady's maid knew Greek as well as French, and the butler had looked at Cecily as though she had confessed to some mild crime. It was the 3rd week of November, and the estate at Ashvale was hosting 8 guests for a fortnight's assembly, and Cecily had spent those 3 weeks becoming the sort of woman the room decided was not worth deciding anything about. She was plain in the way that well-born women ruined by poverty often were. Features too specific to be pretty. A gown of dark green merino retrimmed 3 times until the braid along the hem was a shade lighter than the rest. Hair dressed well enough because that was her function. Hands that were neither soft nor rough, but something practical in between. She was 24 years old, and she had been in service 14 months. And before that, she had been a clergyman's daughter with a library, and before that she had been someone entirely different. Lord Ashvale himself sat at the head of the table. He was 36 and looked it in the way that men who have stopped performing youth look it. The jaw set, the dark hair showing the first threads of silver at the temple, the eyes a specific gray-blue that Cecily had noted and immediately told herself she had no occasion to note again. He spoke sparingly. He looked at his guests with the kind of attention that was less like interest and more like inventory. He had looked at Cecily exactly once since her arrival. In the library on the 2nd morning, when she had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, and he had passed through without stopping, and she had felt the look between her shoulder blades as precisely as a hand placed there. She did not think of it afterward. She told herself she did not. Lady Marbrook was still speaking. She was the elder sister of Lord Ashvale's late wife, a handsome woman in her middle 50s who wore her diamonds as other women wore convictions, and she had decided, in the first 10 minutes of Cecily's arrival, what Cecily was. The decision had required no consultation. "A lady's maid and nothing more," she had said to Mrs. Fenwick, the nearest neighbor's wife, in the corridor outside the sitting room, loudly enough that the corridor carried it. "One hopes she knows her place better than her station suggests." Cecily had heard it. She had been carrying little Harriet's pressed flowers to the nursery, and she had continued walking, and the pressed flowers had not shaken in her hands. Now Lady Marbrook was recounting a visit to Rome, which she had made in her youth, and which she referenced as frequently as other people reference scripture. She was speaking of an inscription on a tomb, and she had mangled the Latin 3 times. And at the 4th attempt something happened in Cecily's chest that she was not quick enough to suppress. "Parce sepulto," she said. It came out quietly, corrective, directed at no one in particular, the way one corrects a mispronunciation that is beginning to cause genuine confusion about meaning. The table froze. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was 7 syllables in a room where the only expected sounds were the movement of silver against china and the managed murmur of approved conversation, and it dropped into that murmur and silenced it as completely as a stone dropped into still water silences the surface. 23 candles continued burning. The footman near the door did not move. Lord Ashvale's glass was halfway to his mouth, and it stopped. Lady Marbrook turned to look at Cecily, with the expression of a woman who has discovered something in an expected place that should not be there. "I beg your pardon," Cecily said, because she had been trained to beg pardon, and because she had already understood what she had done. "You interrupted me," Lady Marbrook said. "I corrected a pronunciation, my lady. Forgive me. The phrase means spare the one already buried. I should not have spoken." "No," Lady Marbrook said. "You should not have." The silence held for another moment, and then Lord Ashvale set his glass down, and conversation resumed around the table in the careful way that conversations resume when everyone is pretending to have noticed less than they have. Cecily ate her soup and counted the candles again. There were still 23. If you find yourself wanting to know what happened after that dinner, stay close. The next quarter hour of this story repaid the first in ways Lady Marbrook did not anticipate. She had come to Ashvale in October, following her employer, Miss Portia Felton, who was Lady Marbrook's distant cousin and Harriet's legal guardian for another 7 months. Portia was kind in the vague way of people who have not yet had occasion to be unkind, and she had written to Lord Ashvale requesting the use of a guest suite during the fortnight's assembly, because she could not afford the inn at Whitbrook, and she could not bring herself to say so plainly. And Lord Ashvale had written back in 4 sentences that said yes. Cecily had been engaged to dress Portia's hair, and manage Harriet's person, and do the 24 other things that a lady's maid without an actual lady did, and she had done them with the same quiet competency she had applied to everything since her father's death had retired her from the world of books and installed her in the world of service. She did not complain about this. She had not complained about it to anyone, including herself, in the full and private internal sense that would have required her to name what had been lost. The library at Ashvale had been a difficulty she had not anticipated. It ran the full length of the East Wing's ground floor, floor to ceiling, the shelves fitted in walnut that had darkened to something close to black, the books organized in a system she had deciphered on the 3rd morning. Classical literature on the south wall, theology on the east, natural philosophy filling the west alcove, history and travel in no particular order across the north. There was a copy of Virgil's Eclogues that she had not opened, because opening it would have required her to acknowledge wanting to, and she had gotten very good at not acknowledging want. She came to the library at 6 in the morning, before the household woke, because the hour was hers by default, and because Harriet slept until 7, and because it was November, and the rest of the house was cold in the particular way of large houses in November, and the library fire was laid and lit each evening and held warmth through the night. She did not read. She sat near the fire, and she thought about the day's tasks, and she occasionally looked at the shelves. She told herself this was self-discipline. Lord Ashvale found her there on the 5th morning. He came in before 6, which she had not expected, and he stopped when he saw her. And she rose from the chair immediately and said, "My lord, I beg your pardon. I was not aware the room was needed. I will withdraw." "Sit down," he said. She sat down. He crossed to the west alcove and took a book from the shelf without consulting the organization at all, which meant he knew where everything was without needing to look, and he settled into the chair on the other side of the fire, and he read, and she remained still in her chair, and watched the flames, and tried to determine whether she had been dismissed or retained, and could not settle the question. After 20 minutes, he said, without looking up, "You can read if you like. The shelves are organized." "I know," she said. He looked up then. Not a long look. Just the moment of recalibration that happens when someone has confirmed something you suspected and were not sure you wanted confirmed. "Classical literature, south wall," she said. "Theology east. Natural philosophy, west alcove." He looked back at his book. "The Virgil is in poor condition," he said. "The binding is cracked. There is a better copy in the locked cabinet, if you ask Mrs. Hawes." She did not respond immediately. She was performing a calculation she had no business performing, which was whether this was kindness or habit or something else entirely. "Thank you, my lord," she said. He said nothing further. She did not go to the locked cabinet. She came back the next morning, and the morning after, and she sat near the fire, and she looked at the shelves, and she did not read. And he arrived each time at 6:15, and sat in the opposite chair, and read without speaking. And the silence between them had a quality she could not name, and tried not to examine. She was what Lady Marbrook had stated in the sitting room with the pale yellow walls 2 days earlier, loudly enough that the wallpaper seemed to absorb it. "A lady's maid and nothing more," she had said to Portia, and I should not need to remind anyone of that twice. This was established. The dinner incident spread through the guest rooms in the way that interesting things spread through guest rooms, efficiently and with improvements. By the following morning, Cecily had been reported to have not merely corrected Lady Marbrook's pronunciation, but to have delivered a brief lecture on Roman funerary customs. By luncheon, the lecture had included a quotation from Cicero. By the evening, one version had her standing to make the correction, which she had not done. She had been very precisely seated, and very precisely quiet in every way, except the one that mattered. Lady Marbrook sought out Portia Felton in the yellow sitting room before supper. Cecily was in the corridor outside, waiting to accompany Portia to the dining room, and the door was not fully closed. "Your maid is insolent," Lady Marbrook said. "I am astonished you permit it." "Cecily is very well behaved," Portia said, in the placid tone she used for disagreements she had not yet decided to have. "She did not mean any harm. She interrupted me at dinner, in front of Lord Ashvale and 8 guests. These are the manners you permit in your household? I was not aware she had interrupted you precisely. I thought she had simply spoken." "Ladies' maids do not simply speak at dinner tables, Portia. This one seems to believe the rules do not apply to her, because she reads Latin. It is extraordinarily presumptuous." A pause. "Lord Ashvale will think the worse of you for it." Cecily stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and thought about the pressed flowers she had carried to the nursery on the first day, the way they had not shaken. She had been a clergyman's daughter with a library. She had read Virgil at 12 and Cicero at 14, and had translated 2 letters of Pliny for her father's amusement when she was 16. She had studied alongside her father's students in the evenings, when propriety permitted it, and in the library when propriety did not think to look. And when her father died, and the living passed to a cousin, and the library was sold at auction, she had stood in the empty room and said goodbye to it in Latin, under her breath, because no one was there to hear, and because it was the language she thought in when the grief was too large for English. She had not, in 14 months of service, made the mistake of forgetting what she was, until last night, with the soup going cold and Lady Marbrook mangling a dead woman's epitaph. Lord Ashvale appeared at the library at his usual 6:15 the following morning. Cecily was already there. She had the Virgil in her hands, the cracked copy, which she had finally taken from the shelf, because the morning felt like a mourning for allowing herself things. He looked at the book. He said nothing. He went to the west alcove. She put the book back. "I did not say put it back," he said, without turning. She took it out again. He brought his own book to the chair across from hers and sat down, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from the previous mornings, a pressure to it, like weather before rain. After a time he said, Lady Marbrook has requested that Miss Felton dismiss you. Cecily closed the Virgil. She looked at her hands. I see. Miss Felton has declined, for the present. She is very kind. Lady Marbrook will not let the matter rest. She looked up. He was not looking at her, or he had been, and had stopped. She could not determine the sequence precisely. His face was what it usually was. Level, the jaw set, something contained behind the eyes that she had learned to stop trying to read in the mornings, because reading it required more attention than she could professionally justify. Then I will leave at the end of the fortnight, she said. It is the sensible course. Is it what you want? The question landed in the room like the Latin had landed at the dinner table, precisely calibrated and unsettling in its specificity. What I want is not the relevant consideration, she said. I am asking it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. The fire made a small sound. No, she said. It is not what I want. He looked at her then, directly, without the slight deflection that had characterized every previous look she could remember cataloging and immediately dismissing. What is your name? He said. Your given name. Cecily. He said it once, quietly, to himself, as though confirming it. Then he looked back at his book, and the conversation was apparently concluded. And she held the cracked Virgil in her hands for the rest of the hour, and thought about nothing she would let herself name. Now is the moment this story tends to ask something of you. If Cecily's situation has settled itself somewhere behind your sternum, leave a word in the quiet below this. She will not hear it. But the keeping of it matters. Harriet had been following Cecily for 11 days, with the devotion of a child who has found something she recognizes as trustworthy and intends to remain near it indefinitely. She was 6 years old and brown-haired and solemn in the specific way of children who have been recently transplanted and are performing the work of figuring out which things in the new landscape will hold. She asked Cecily to teach her things. Cecily taught her the names of the birds outside the nursery window, first in English, and then, quietly, in Latin. Because the Latin names sounded like small spells, and Harriet appreciated the feeling of knowing something invisible. She taught her the proper way to curtsy to a countess, which was different from the way one curtsied to a duchess, and Harriet practiced the distinction with great seriousness until she had it right. Lord Ashvale watched Harriet from a distance that was precisely maintained. He was her father's cousin, and her father had been dead 2 years, and there was between them a careful warmth that looked like reserve, and was not. Cecily had seen him once, in the garden, stop beside the stone wall where Harriet was examining a patch of winter-brown grass, and crouch down to her level, and say something she could not hear. Harriet had looked up at him with the expression of a child who has just been given accurate information about something important. He had stood again and walked on. She had not meant to see it. She had been in the garden for the cold air, which she needed, and she had looked away immediately, and it had remained with her in the manner of things one has not been given permission to keep. Lady Marbrook escalated on the 4th day after the dinner. She had been circling the subject with Mrs. Fenwick in various rooms, which Cecily knew because Harriet reported these things with the guileless accuracy of a child who does not understand yet that adults would prefer not to be heard. Lady Marbrook says you are fast, Harriet announced, coming into the nursery while Cecily was mending a ribbon. And Mrs. Fenwick said she was merely a lady's maid and nothing more, and Lady Marbrook said yes, and that was the proper way to remember it. I do not know what that means when it is a person instead of a horse. It means she does not approve of me, Cecily said. Why not? She believes certain things should stay in certain places. Harriet considered this. Are you in the wrong place? Cecily folded the mended ribbon. That is an excellent question. The formal declaration came at tea. Lady Marbrook was presiding over the table in the blue drawing room with the confidence of a woman who has been presiding over tables for 30 years and has never once had the table fail to cooperate. There were 6 women present, and Portia was there, and Cecily was there, because Harriet had demanded her presence, and Portia had not had the firmness to refuse, and Lady Marbrook waited until the second cup had been poured, and then said, still addressing the room rather than any specific person in it, "It is a pity that certain members of this party do not understand the value of discretion. Women of restricted means would do well to remember that intelligence, however genuine, is not the same as education, and neither is the same as breeding." The room registered this with the small visible adjustment that polite rooms make when something has been said that everyone wishes had not been said in quite that way. "Cecily," said Harriet, who was sitting beside her on the settee and who had been listening with the focused attention she brought to everything, "what does breeding mean in that sentence? Is it about horses again?" One of the younger women made a sound that was not quite laughter, and then corrected it immediately. Lady Marbrook's eyes moved to Cecily. The message in them was plain. Control the child, or confirm my point. It means the manner of one's birth and upbringing, Cecily said to Harriet, in the same even tone she always used. Lady Marbrook is pointing out that some advantages come from birth, rather than from study. My papa said study was better, Harriet said. He said breeding was an accident, but learning was a choice. The silence that followed was shorter than the silence at the dinner table, but had a different quality. Lady Marbrook set down her teacup. Portia looked at Cecily with an expression of mixed apology, and something that might have been surprised admiration. And Cecily looked back at her with an expression that said, "Please do not apologize on my behalf in front of these people." And Portia, who had known Cecily long enough to read the expression, did not apologize. Lord Ashvale was not at tea. He heard about it from his steward, who had heard it from the footman, who had heard it from the parlor maid, which was the usual path by which the dining and drawing-room events reached the study at Ashvale. Cecily knew this, because he appeared at the library the following morning at 6 rather than a quarter past, and he was there before her. She stopped in the doorway. "Come in," he said. She came in. He was standing rather than seated, which was unusual, and the fire was already high, which meant he had been there long enough to have built it up, or had asked it built before he arrived. And she could not determine which told her more. "Lady Marbrook leaves on Thursday," he said. "I am glad of it," Cecily said, which was not the careful answer, and was apparently the true one, because she had not intended to say it. "She was my wife's sister," he said. He said it without inflection, in the way of a man naming a fact whose weight he has carried long enough that he no longer shows the effort. "I know. I am sorry for your loss. She was not an easy woman, my wife. She was intelligent, and she knew it. And she had been taught that knowing it was not respectable, which made her careful in ways that were sometimes costly." He looked at the fire. "She would have been better served by a world that did not require her to be careful about knowing things." Cecily stood very still. She was doing a thing she did sometimes, which was staying exactly in the place she was, and not moving, because she understood that moving would break something that had not yet finished being said. "There is a portrait," he said, "in the study. She is reading in it, which the painter thought undignified, and she argued with him about it until he agreed, and it is the only likeness of her I have kept. She sounds as though she was worth knowing." She was. A long moment. "You remind me of her in some respects." not in appearance, in the particular quality of stillness that occurs when someone is actively deciding what they are permitted to feel. Cecily looked at him. He looked back. It was the second time he had looked directly, and it was longer than the first. And her pulse was doing something she had been carefully not noticing for 11 days, and which was now not possible to not notice. "I should not be reminded of her," she said quietly. "It cannot be comfortable." "I did not say it was uncomfortable." The fire made its small sound again. Outside, November was doing what it always did, which was being gray and specific and indifferent to everything occurring inside the house. "I am a lady's maid," she said. Not defensively, as an observation, as the naming of a fact whose weight she had also been carrying. "I know what you are," he said. "I have also been wondering what you were before." She was quiet for a long time. "A clergyman's daughter with a library," she said at last. "Until 14 months ago." He did not fill the silence with sympathy, which was the thing she had been afraid of. He stood with it, and then he said, "The locked cabinet has a second Virgil. Complete. In better condition than the Aeneid on the south wall. You told me to ask Mrs. Hawes. I'm telling you now to ask me." She looked at him. He was not performing kindness. He was performing something more precise than kindness, which was recognition, the specific act of looking at a person and seeing the actual shape of them, rather than the category they have been assigned. It was more difficult to receive than she had anticipated. "I should get Harriet ready for her morning lessons," she said. "You should." She went. She walked down the corridor at a pace that was entirely composed, and she did not let herself feel anything until she was in the small room beside the nursery. That was hers, with the door shut. And then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for 4 minutes. Then she went to get Harriet ready for lessons. The crisis arrived 3 days before Lady Marbrook's scheduled departure, because crises in this kind of household had a way of arriving precisely when they would cause the most disruption to the greatest number of carefully maintained arrangements. It came in the form of a letter delivered to Portia at breakfast from a solicitor named Whitmore in London, informing her that the trust established by Harriet's father had been contested by a cousin of the second degree, and that the contesting party was prepared to argue that Portia's guardianship was informal and therefore voidable, and that Miss Harriet's person and estate would be better managed by the family in its more senior branch. Portia brought the letter to Cecily in the nursery because she did not know what else to do with it, and Cecily read it twice and felt something cold settle in her chest, because she knew what Harriet's father had intended, and she knew what Whitmore's letter was, which was a piece of legal machinery being operated by someone who had not thought carefully about whether the machinery was just. "You need to speak to Lord Ashvale," Cecily said. "He is Harriet's relation," Portia said. "He may side with the cousin." "He will not. You sound very certain." Cecily folded the letter and handed it back. "He will not," she said again. She was right. She knew she was right in the way she sometimes knew things about him that she had not been given permission to know, which was from observation accumulated across 18 mornings in the library and the specific quality of the way he had crouched in the garden to speak to Harriet at her level. Lord Ashvale read the letter in 3 minutes and then set it down and looked at Portia. "Who is the cousin?" "A Mr. Farley, my lord, in Surrey." "I know Farley. He is manageable." He looked at Cecily, who was standing slightly behind Portia's chair, and who had apparently not made herself invisible enough to be excluded from the meeting. "What do you know of the trust's provisions?" Cecily blinked. "I have not read them." "But—" She hesitated. "The letter misquotes the standard language for a contested informal guardianship. The phrase it cites, pertaining to senior branch precedents, was altered in 1814. The version it invokes was superseded. The silence in the room was shorter than the one at the dinner table, but had a larger weight. "You know trust law," he said. It was not a question. "My father sat on the vestry," she said. And he read everything aloud. "I will write to my own solicitor this morning," he said. "Farley will find the ground considerably less stable than he anticipates." He was still looking at her. "Would you be willing to write down the specific provision you are thinking of? In precise terms, not summary terms." "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked at Portia. "Miss Felton, I recommend you do not respond to Whitmore until you have heard from me. 3 days." Portia agreed with the relieved docility of someone who has been waiting for a person to take the appropriate shape for the situation. And Lord Ashvale left the room. And Cecily sat down at the small writing desk in the corner and wrote out, in her clearest hand, the exact language of the provision she was thinking of and the date of its amendment and the 2 cases that had tested its application. She delivered it to him at 11 in the study. He read it carefully. He said, without looking up, "Your father's students were fortunate." She said nothing. "So are you unfortunate," he said, "or merely provisional?" She understood the question. She had been asking herself a version of it for 14 months. "I have not decided," she said. "Then do not decide until I have spoken to you again." Farley's letter, as it turned out, collapsed without requiring Lord Ashvale's solicitor to do more than address 3 sentences to Whitmore's firm outlining the superseded provision. The collapse came back through the proper channels in writing within 48 hours, which was faster than most legal matters moved, and which suggested that Whitmore's firm had known the ground was unstable before they sent the letter. Lady Marbrook left on Thursday as scheduled. Her departure required 3 carriages and considerable directing of footmen, and one final exchange with Cecily in the upper corridor that went as follows. "I expect you are pleased with yourself," Lady Marbrook said. "No, my lady. You have made yourself necessary by some means I do not fully understand. That will last only as long as it is convenient." "I expect you are right," Cecily said. Lady Marbrook studied her for a moment, and something in the studying shifted. Not into warmth, but into a recognition that was not nothing. "My sister would have liked you," she said. It came out differently than Cecily expected. Not a compliment exactly, not a weapon exactly, just a true thing said by a woman who had more true things than she usually permitted herself. Then she went downstairs, and her carriages departed at 9, and the house breathed differently after. Lord Ashvale found her in the library that afternoon, which was the first time he had sought her out there outside of their established mornings. It was 2:30, and the winter light was going early, the way it did in November, the room already moving into that warm amber quality that came when the daylight started to lose its conviction. She was reading. She had taken the Virgil from the south wall, the cracked one, and she was reading it properly this time, seated in her usual chair, and she looked up when he came in. "Parce sepulto," he said. And there was something in his voice that she had not heard before, a thread of something almost light. "It is from the Aeneid," she said. "6th book. Spare the one already buried. I know what it is from." He was not moving toward the other chair exactly. He was standing between the door and the fireplace with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, which was controlled. This was the stillness of a man who has made a decision and is now in the moment before saying it. "Miss Felton is to leave at the end of the fortnight," he said, "with Harriet, who will return to London. The guardianship is secure." "Yes." "She intends to take you with her." "Yes." "I would like," he said, and then he stopped, and the stopping had a quality she had never heard from him, which was that it was not deliberate. She set the Virgil down. "I would like to propose that you remain at Ashvele," he said. "Not as a lady's maid, in a different capacity, which we would have to discuss with appropriate propriety and the involvement of a solicitor and whatever other machinery the situation requires. But I would like to propose it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are proposing," she said carefully, "that I remain." "I'm proposing that you marry me," he said, "in the plainest possible terms, because I have been indirect about everything for long enough, and it has not served either of us." The fire made its sound. The light continued its slow amber transformation. She could feel her heartbeat in her hands, which were folded in her lap, and she was glad she was sitting because her legs were doing something uncertain. "You know what I am," she said. "A clergyman's daughter with a library," he said. "Reduced by circumstances 14 months ago to a situation that did not fit. I know exactly what you are. I have known it since the second morning." "The library," she said. "The library." She looked at the shelves, the south wall, the Virgil, the cracked binding. She thought about her father reading aloud in the evenings, the smell of old paper and tallow candles, the weight of knowing things in a world that had not quite decided what to do with a woman who knew them. "Parce sepulto," she said quietly, and it meant something slightly different when she said it now, which was, "Do not bury this one yet. There is still something alive here." "Yes," he said. She looked back at him. "Ask me again in proper form," she said, "with the machinery and the solicitor and whatever else is required. Ask me correctly." "I intend to." She stood and returned the Virgil to the south wall and smoothed her skirt, which was the dark green merino, the braid slightly lighter at the hem, the same gown she had been wearing at the dinner table when she had said the words that froze the room. She turned back toward him. "Then I will give you my answer when you do," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Then he went to the west alcove and took down his book, and she went to the door to return to her duties, and at the threshold she paused. "Lord Ashvale," she said. "Miss Vane." She left. She walked down the corridor at an entirely composed pace, and the pace contained her, and her hands did not shake, and the light coming through the window at the corridor's end was that specific British afternoon quality, golden and soft and forgiving of everything that the morning had not quite resolved. The solicitor arrived from London on the following Monday, which Lord Ashvale had arranged with a speed that suggested he had been considering the arrangement before he had admitted it to himself. The papers were handled correctly. Portia Felton was consulted and gave her blessing with a warmth that suggested she had been expecting this and was principally relieved. Harriet, when informed, announced that this was the obvious course, and she did not understand why it had taken so long. The question of whether it was appropriate was raised by 2 of the remaining guests and answered by Lord Ashvale in 4 sentences that left the matter settled. Cecily said yes in the study, where the solicitor sat with his papers, and Lord Ashvale stood at the window, and the gray November sky outside was doing its usual thing. And she said yes, with the steadiness of a woman who has spent 14 months not deciding what she was, and has now decided. The small ceremony was quiet. Harriet held a posy of winter-dried herbs she had assembled herself, which she said was appropriate because Latin names. The guests remaining at Ashvale attended, and most of them looked on with the expression of people who recognize that something has happened that they will be describing for years. Lady Marbrook was not there, but she sent a letter, which arrived 3 days before Christmas, addressed to Cecily in a hand that was very precisely formed, and which said, among other things, that my sister would indeed have liked you, and that I hope you will be the kind of woman who is irritating enough to keep him honest. Cecily read the letter beside the library fire, which was hers now in the proprietary sense, as well as the habitual sense, and then she folded it and put it in the drawer of the writing desk that had been her father's, which she had brought with her from storage in London when the rest of her father's things had been sold. The desk was small and plain and slightly battered at the left corner, and it was the only thing she had kept. And she kept it because it was the surface on which he had read aloud to her in the evenings, her sitting on the floor beside him, the lamplight making everything amber and specific and permanent. Lord Ashvale came in at 6:30, which was now his usual time rather than his earlier time, because some things had shifted in the household's arrangement. He sat in his chair. She sat in hers. The Virgil was on the small table between them, the cracked one from the south wall, because she had decided she liked the cracked one, and she was allowed to decide that now. He looked at it and said nothing. She looked at the fire and said nothing. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to come down in the soft, specific way of English snow, which does not commit fully, but suggests itself around the edges of things. Harriet's voice came from somewhere in the upper part of the house, counting something in a language that was not quite Latin and not quite English, but something between, which was what happened when a 6-year-old took instruction seriously and applied it according to her own interior logic. Cecily listened to it for a moment. Then she opened the Virgil to the 6th book and found the line. And she did not read it aloud, because she did not need to. She read the next one instead. Thank you for staying. If Cecily's quiet, particular stubbornness settled itself somewhere in your chest tonight, leave a word for her below this. She would appreciate knowing she was heard. She had not expected to cry, and she did not. But she sat for a long time in the amber light of the library and thought about the library in the house where she had grown up, which had been smaller and smelled of damp leather, and had a window that faced north, so the light was always cool and blue rather than warm. And she thought about the morning she had stood in it after the auction and said goodbye to it in Latin. And she thought about the word that had come to her then, which was the same word that had come to her now, sitting in this different library, in this different kind of light, which was enough, not in the sense of sufficiency, as though she had settled for less than she wanted, in the sense of arrival, as though everything that had been accumulating for 14 months had now arrived at a point it had been moving toward all along, and the word for that point was enough, and the weight of it was not small, but it was the right weight, the weight of something true. She turned the page of the Virgil. The 6th book was long, and she was not going to finish it tonight. She had the rest of the winter for that. She had many winters. Outside, the snow continued its particular English suggestion of itself, coming down in the slow, steady way that did not insist and did not apologize, and the fire in the library was warm and specific, and Lord Ashvale was reading something in the west alcove that he had not told her the title of, which was fine because she had not asked. She would ask tomorrow.